Okay, let's get into Chapter 10, talking about elections and voting. And as with some of the other chapters, I'll be covering some things on these slides that aren't specifically in the book, just to enhance some information on elections here. So be sure to watch the videos with the readings of the book. Major purpose of elections, first of all, particularly in democratic systems, because once you establish elections in your system, that is one of the criterias of a democratic political culture. Fundamental aspect of democracy. Also is used to build support for the state through participating in this process of government. And it also serves to reassure the public in terms of transference of power, inspire confidence in the system that we are successfully transitioning from one person to the next, one party to the next. Now, there are elections in authoritarian systems. There are quite a few countries in the world that do have elections, but they are relatively authoritarian, particularly in the single party authoritarian system that we've talked about before. The single party maintains control of the election system through patronage, clientelism. This is where the leaders promise jobs and promise favors. And so, therefore, the exchanged bribes of jobs and favors and things like that will permeate throughout the system. So, even at the grassroots level, you'll have loyal officials there that are part of the party's patronage system, and they will ensure that the turnout is for the party in power, and so therefore the power just gets more entrenched, and they just keep getting elected, and other parties really have not much of a chance to get their foot in the door, so it becomes a single party authoritarian system. In these elections, the outcome is rarely ever in doubt, and they have an element of staging in order to try to give a show of enthusiasm or support in a system that people don't have much of a say in. Now let's talk about two basic types of electoral systems: the single member district system and the proportional representation system. The single member district system, SMD, sometimes called the single member district plurality. Talk about that in a second. What happens here is that the state is divided up into relatively equally populated districts. And what makes it a single member district is that one representative is elected per district. And this is how the United States system is structured, as well as Britain, Canada, India, some others. In the United States, there's approximately 700,000 people per district, and that gets redrawn every 10 years with the census. In 2020, it may be up around 800,000 or so per district when they get the census and redraw the district. And the plurality refers to the fact that just the person that has the greatest number of votes will win that election. Here is the congressional districts map for the United States. There's 435 districts, congressional districts in the United States, and they're all broken up along state lines, as we'll talk about a little bit more as far as voting. And so the House of Representatives is made up of 435 members, one representative from each district. For example, Texas, my home state, has got 36 representative U.S. congressional districts. So therefore, 36 representatives, one elected from each one of these districts, goes to Washington to sit in the House of Representatives. New Jersey, for example, has 12 U.S. congressional districts. These are the districts in New Jersey, and they were established in 2010 after the census. There's 12 districts in New Jersey. This District 9 right here, I want to focus on that. That's the district that I live in, so let's zoom in on that one. Here is District 9, the 9th Congressional District. Bill Pascrell is the House of Representative person that sits in the House there. And the looks like a bat, but the districts are drawn by the state legislatures. Now, the other major type of electoral system is what is called proportional representation, or just PR. And this is where the party's representation in the legislative body is roughly proportional to what they win in the election. So fairly straightforward translation there, proportional representation. The proportional representation system has got some pretty significant differences that would be very difficult for the United States to transition to very quickly. It would probably take a pretty long evolving process for the United States to transition to a system like this, because it's just not what we've been socialized into for many generations. But typically you have multi-member districts in this type of system. So what happens is that the parties provide a list of their candidates in order of preference for each district. So therefore you've got several members that are going to be elected from each district. So it's fairly straightforward. If a party gets 40% of the vote in that district, and of course you have your ballots are basically you're voting for the number of candidates on your ballot that equals the number of members that are going to be coming from that district. That's part of what makes this happen. So if that party gets 40% of the vote, it will actually get 40% of the seats in that district. And the top members of that list, however number members that is going to fill those 40% of seats, those are the people that are going to be sitting in that parliament. So that's why the order of that list is pretty important, because they want the most prominent or most successful or the most recognizable names at the top and put them in order of importance. And in many cases, the top person on that list would be potentially the prime minister. And so looking at another example, as shown in the book, Israel is a small enough country where the entire country is literally one district, so to speak. And there's 120 seats in their parliament, also called the Knesset. And so once again, here the parties submit the list of their candidates in the order of their preference. And they have a threshold requirement here. Any party receiving at least 2% of the vote gets at least one seat. And so that is an interesting distinction, because here in America, we're typically voting for the candidate, but yet in our two-party system, we have so much complaining about, oh, it's just about the two major parties. Well, ironically, in these proportional representation systems, you're actually voting for the party. And the party that wins control of the parliament has very much, not unlimited, but very much a lot of power to get what they are been elected to do to get done. So in 2009, you can see the chart in the book there, 12 different parties garnered enough votes to have seats in their parliament. And so let's look at a couple of distinctions here between single member district and proportional representation. The SMD does favor the large parties and a two-party system. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. This is one of the structural elements in our Constitution that facilitates a two-party system. So with this single member district plurality, there's no incentive for third parties to vie for a second place. See, that's where these proportional representation parties have these proportional representation systems have multiple parties, because therefore, if you have, for example, 5 seats that are coming from one district, well, then you're going to have at least 6 parties vying for those seats, because somebody could actually win that 5th seat. So therefore, you'd have at least 6 parties trying to contest for those 5 seats. Whereas if you only have one person coming from that district, there's no second place. There's no reward for second place, so therefore no incentive for third parties to get involved. And anyone who votes on the third party pretty much knows that they're wasting their vote. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. Now, of course, if a third party has a strong regional presence, it could literally win enough votes in that district to get a representative from that district. The PR system, obviously, you have a wider range of choices because of the more parties. The parties are vying for several positions in each district. Votes, again, are for a party at large generally, so typically voters are voting for a party. We do see that turnout is typically larger in the PR systems because there's a little bit more to keep track of, perhaps a little bit more interest generated by having more of a mix of parties to be elected. Now, governing majority of the parliament in these systems may require coalitions because, for example, if the predominant party only wins 40% of the vote, and then the next party wins 30% of the vote, and then another party wins 10% of the vote, and then so forth, well, in order to have a ruling coalition, the major party may actually have to come together with one of the or more of the smaller parties in order to have 50% control of that house. So that does provide a little bit more incentive for smaller parties to get involved because they could actually be part of the ruling coalition. It provides some interesting combinations where you might have a conservative leaning party coalitioning with perhaps a pro-environmental party because they have some interests in common, and so therefore it's in their interest to bond together to have a 50% or more control of that parliament. So you can have some interesting bedfellows, so to speak, with these coalitions, and that's part of why it generates a little bit more interest and turnout a little bit larger. Now, as far as some attempts to have a more direct democracy where the voters vote directly on policy, we've got a couple of options in the United States. In general, what we have is a referendum process. And as I mentioned in the comments to your Bill of Rights there, where the idea of this was presented for one of the rights, well, we do have about 31 states that do have a referendum or an initiative process where voters can vote directly on a ballot on a proposal or a measure, typically to approve or reject an existing law or a bond issue or any changes to the Constitution, that they can go either perhaps start a petition and then vote on a proposal, or in many cases the legislature puts it out there for the people to vote on. Initiatives are a little bit more substantial. Citizens can initiate and ratify changes in the Constitution through an initiative. And so the voters are approving actual constitutional amendments and new statutes. So the direct initiative, the voters propose it themselves, completely bypassing the legislature. But there are some states that have an indirect initiative system to where the voters propose a change to the Constitution or a new law, but then it gets submitted to the legislature for them to vote on. Now keep in mind, these referendums and initiative options here are not available in the United States at the federal level. We do not have a method of bypassing the United States Congress with a referendum or an initiative like you do in the states. Is in some states, as you can see, we've got a total of, well, excuse me, I said 31. Looks like we've got 27 states total that have either a referendum or an issue. So that's just a little more than half the states. And this gives you the details of what that state has available that they can use in their state. There's not been a lot of activity pursuing this. As you can see, when you look at these dates adopted here, the vast majority of them were done during the Progressive Era, when we had a pretty major shift in trying to get more people involved in the government. And so since that time, there have been just a few changes and hardly any within the last few decades. So that gets to some questions as to what are some of the problems with this direct democracy. I've alluded to a couple of them before, but if we throw it out there in a relatively short, concise explanation, because in order for it to get on the ballot, it's got to be pretty short, sweet, concise, so that the public can understand what it means so they can vote typically yes or no. So the proposed law may not get the same level of consideration or deliberation through this process, and this yes-no option may not reflect the complexity that's involved with this particular issue. And as we've said before, the public is generally ill-informed, driven by our emotions, our opinions, and our passions. That's not meant to be bad. That's just how we are. And that's one of the reasons why politicians do and say the things they do, is because they are trying to appeal to your emotions and your passions and your feelings. That's what they're trying to generate your support, and not necessarily by appealing to your intellect or logic is effective as dealing to our system one thinking. Another question here is that, well, if we're hiring, i.e., if we're electing politicians to do this for us, why are we bypassing them? And if we're bypassing them, we're not really technically able to put as much deliberation into them as the politicians that are paid and sitting in the legislatures to do this. And so attempts at direct democracy are almost saying, well, we're losing trust in your ability to do this. And so what's wrong with the system there? Maybe we should just hire better politicians, because or politicians that are more able to work together and solve problems. Maybe that's the solution rather than bypassing them. So that's why you've got considerable concerns with the direct democracy. And as I said before, one of the general issues with the framers of our Constitution was this concept of a pure or a direct democracy, which would perhaps lend to mob rule or tyranny of the majority. And once again, once you have passed this measure, the implementation, particularly with a very brief, concise law, that leaves a lot of interpretation for the bureaucrats in the executive branches to implement these laws. So therefore, with this direct democracy, you're literally giving more delegation and authority to the bureaucratic element of government to implement that law that's very vague to begin with, and then is going to require quite a bit of reading between the lines and filling in the blanks in order to implement it and enforce it. Winston Churchill, literal quote machine there, talking about his consternation with democracy at times. And speaking of his consternation with democracy, let's talk about electoral participation, particularly in the United States. United States presidential elections, the turnout is typically less than 55%. So what that means is that just a little more than half of all the Americans that are eligible to vote even bother to show up to vote. in the presidential elections, which everybody knows so much about. And so that's a very interesting paradox, you could say, in to live in the most successful, arguably prosperous, stable country in the world, but yet barely half of us even show up to vote. And there could be some long-term dysfunctional consequences of that if it continues to wane, because it used to be higher than that on average. Sweden, which doesn't even require people to vote by law, it has a very volunteeristic culture that more of a civic duty to vote, so they have a very high turnout. There are some countries that have a pretty high turnout, but they literally require and make it mandatory to vote. So it's a function of your civic culture, your active, your attentive citizenry, your trust and support of the government. There is a lot of study with political science in that the more non-participants that we have, that's increasing the potential, like a powder keg, for disruption. If you have a lot of people that are just not paying attention and then something goes wrong, the trust or the lack of trust in government could explode into some pretty serious situations. Now, another kind of dilemma here with elections is the political parties. They're spending a lot of effort trying to get their supporters to the polls, not to increase the election turnout in general. In fact, there's been quite a few allegations and even court cases, and actually some striking down of some new voter laws because uh, through rational efforts of trying to win the election, the parties could potentially be suppressing the other party's potential voters. So that's working against overall electoral participation. Now, here's a chart from the Pew Research Center. Again, one of the more credible research organizations out there. And as you can see, Belgium and Turkey, the asterisk means that their voting is required, so they have very high turnout. Sweden, however, very high turnout, as I said, but not even mandatory. Most of these countries here, not mandatory, and have a considerably higher turnout than the United States, which is down here towards the low end of all these states. Now you can see from this chart, the percent of registered voters that vote is pretty high in the United States. However, we've got a relatively low percentage of people that are registered because that's something that we have to choose to do. It's not mandatory and it's not a simple process. So we have a fairly low, relatively speaking, number of people that are registered. So that also contributes to our low voter turnout down here. So you can look at this list and see the comparisons. Now, as far as in the United States, who typically votes more than others? Well, the older you are, that's a direct correlation. The older you are, the more you vote. And as you look at each 10-year age increment, you go from 65 and above, highest voter turnout, 65 to 55, next highest, 55 to 45, next highest, and it goes all the way down to where 25 and below, the millennial generation, the lowest. We also know that the higher you are educated, higher income bracket you're in, typically more tendency to vote, perhaps being more aware of the system or more at stake, being higher income. We also know that if you've lived in the same location for more than 5 years, the percentage goes up higher, perhaps because you're more vested in the neighborhood, you're more aware of civic duty of your neighborhood, and that translates to voting in general. We do know that suburbanites and farmers typically vote more. And I just said if you are registered, you're bound to vote more because you've actually gone through that process. You've gone through that first step of which a lot of people consider of a hassle to have to register to vote, but that's just how it works. We have to have a record of who's voting. And so approximately 84% of those people that are registered will vote. But however, as I've said before, only about 65% of the voting age population, that's what the VAP stands for, only 65% is registered. So when you put those two together, that gives us about our 55% turnout right there. Now, what influences voting? As I've said, cultural traditions, very important. How much of a civic duty is it in your country? How much of a volunteerism ethic do you have in your country? Other things, for example, if election day is a working day, that's also a hindrance. Literally, we could enact measures where the national election day is a holiday. That's possible. Not likely in the United States, but that's a possibility. But still an effect on voting. As I said before, registration is somewhat of a hassle. I will post some things online here to show you that it's really not that big of a deal to register, uh, even though you may not be able to do it directly online. You can do it through the mail. Another thing, politics is confusing and as well as frustrating. Could be a turnoff, but politics is confusing in general. And if you're not a loyal party follower, and this is one of the reasons why we have parties, is because politics is confusing. You can just vote for that party that's got your values in mind. And then we do see that if election appears to be close, it could increase in tension, which could affect voter turnout as well. Now, what are some reasons for not voting? And this is an interesting list that came directly from the census. The top reasons for everyone in the United States, interestingly enough, too busy is the number one reason for everyone. When everyone is polled, too busy is the number one reason. Sick, disabled the second. Not interested, don't like choices. And interestingly enough, this is what we'd probably expect from 18 to 24-year-olds. Too busy. And I put a question mark there by that because that does seem like somewhat of a smoke screen for a more important reason. To say that you're too busy to vote when you know 4 years ahead of time when the next presidential election is, it's really hard to justify that you can't prepare 4 years in advance to vote on that one day. So there's other things going on than that. These are probably more valid reasons down here that we can talk about, is in addition to being too busy. The paradox of voting is highly studied in political science as to where are the benefits that you're getting from voting. In other words, the time that it takes you to go vote, to get in your car, to go drive to the polls, to wait in line, is that paying off in benefits as far as the person that you vote for? Is that going to make your life that much better that it overcomes the costs that it requires for you to go vote? Very interesting thing here, because a lot of people realize that in a very, very large election, their vote could potentially be so insignificant that it's not going to make any difference to swing the election. And so therefore it would not be really useful for me to spend the costs of voting when I'm not getting any benefits out of it. And that does kind of go hand in hand with the fact that a lot of people think that their vote doesn't matter. They typically don't put it into this benefits versus cost analysis. In most cases, people are saying that if their vote doesn't matter, is that the system is whether they say the system is rigged or the fact that whoever gets elected, they're going to do the same old things because they're all corrupt, or it's all just a bunch of power elites that are working together. Well, obviously that's not true. It doesn't work that way. Voting does matter. If everybody thought that way and nobody voted, guess what we would have? We would have a dictatorship, and somebody would just be taking charge, and it would be unimaginable how different the system could possibly be if everybody thought that way and nobody voted. So it obviously does matter. And when it comes to president in particular, the president has so much power, particularly with respect to foreign policy, that it certainly matters what kind of person that you're putting into that office. People are typically uninformed, and that translates to, well, I'm too busy to vote because I just don't really know anything about the candidates, don't know anything about the policies, doesn't really translate to my life as far as what it's doing for me. And of course, that even translates to just flat out not interested, which also could be a function of youth, not caring. Again, I was your age once, and just didn't seem to be that is important of a goal to me to vote. Which, as you age and mature and realize, what the system is actually about, well, then it starts to become more important, whether you're informed or not. That yes, it's important to vote. And there's the busy guy going through too busy to vote. All right, so let's talk a few minutes about uh, who do we actually vote for. Now we do know that partisan loyalty, the loyalty to the Republican Party or the loyalty to the Democratic Party, is the strongest predictor of who votes. We already know through decades of research that about 2/3 of Americans are going to vote for that party no matter who the candidate is. So therefore that lends us right back to the proportional representation system. If it doesn't matter who the person is, you're just voting for the party, right? Well, that's what happens amongst 2/3 of Americans. We know that about 1/3 of Americans are loyal to the Republican Party and will vote for the Republican regardless who the candidate is. We know that about 1/3 of Americans will vote for the Democratic candidate regardless of who that candidate is. That's loyalty. And then about 1/3 of Americans are considered independent leaning. However, most of those are also leaning towards one of the parties, because we do know in a two-party system, if you don't vote for one of those parties, your vote is pretty much going to waste. Now, we do know that incumbents have an enormous probability of getting reelected, largely because of the fact that we already know who they are, name recognition. They've got lots of advantages that we can talk about later on, as far as fundraising, head starts, the media attention, mailing privileges, the fact that they can do a lot of work for their constituents to build up their reputation, things like that. So incumbents have an enormous advantage of getting reelected. But again, the people are going to vote for that incumbent based on what party they are, right? So that's kind of goes with it. Now, there are some people that will vote based on their personal interests or where they stand in the economy. For example, if you are a member of a labor union, you would particularly be more interested in voting or leaning more towards the Democratic Party because they're more sympathetic to the working man. If you are a small business owner, you potentially could lean more towards voting towards a Republican because they are perhaps looking out more for the small business owner and that sort of thing. So again, very logical and rational reason for voting is to what is in your best interest as far as your livelihood. There are some people that vote based on what a candidate looks like, or how charismatic they may be, how presidential they look, how confident they present themselves. And we do see that the speaking ability is a very strong predictor of someone who's considered presidential, somebody who has a very good speaking ability. And of course, that translates to every other uh, success formula that's been studied. People who are better speakers, particularly speaking in public, they typically, on average, have been promoted further along, generally a little bit more successful on average. And also another thing that people will vote for, and this also has a little bit to do with mistrust of the system, or just perhaps maybe an attempt to keep it balanced as well. But if one party's been in power for a while and things aren't going all that great, well, time to go to the other party. and so vote for the other guy. So those are some of the things that influence who we vote for. And quote there from George Carlin, right? We can't just put all the blame on the politicians because we're the ones that are putting them there. All right, now as far as preparing for the quiz, as far as for this chapter here that we're talking about, chapter 10, these are the things that we've talked about that you want to focus on to prepare for.